Welcome everyone and happy Friday. We're really delighted so many of you could join us for this webinar on the Cutting the Green Tape initiative that California Secretary of Resources Wade Crowfoot launched about a year ago with the support of the California Landscape Stewardship Network. I looked at the registration list yesterday and saw many of our partners, both restoration practitioners and regulatory agency representatives, as well as supporters and allies. I just want to say sustainable conservation could not do the work it does without you, so thank you all. We're delighted that the Cutting the Green Tape recommendations have been released just last week, and we can all start working on their implementation together. I'm Ashley Boren, the CEO of Sustainable Conservation, and I will be moderating our panel today. We've got three terrific experts on restoration and restoration's regulatory review process for our panel. Jennifer Norris is the Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency, and she is Secretary Crowfoot's point person for Cutting the Green Tape. She was appointed in May, and that means she joined this Green Tape initiative midway through. Prior to her appointment, Jennifer had a long career at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, first in New Mexico and then in California, where she was most recently supervisor of the Sacramento field office. And something personal to know is that Jennifer is a lover of deserts, oceans, and trees, and she very much looks forward to the end of COVID and the opportunity to travel with her adventurous family. Kellyx Nelson is the longtime and talented executive director of the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. Sustainable Conservation's had the pleasure of partnering very closely with Kellyx for many years, and we are always impressed with all she accomplishes in San Mateo County and the region. Kellyx is part of the California Landscape Stewardship Network, and she was a key leader along with Jim Robbins from Ecological and others from the network in the Cutting the Green Tape initiative. And something fun I learned about Kellyx I did not know is that her illustrious career has included driving a Freightliner cross country as a long haul trucker and delivering packages as a motorcycle messenger, which I'm not sure comes in use, but probably does in your role. And then last, but far from least, is Erika Lovejoy, Sustainable Conservation's Program Director for our Accelerating Restoration Initiative. Erika joined us in 2012 when we decided that we needed to move away from creating coordinated permitting programs for restoration county by county and instead move to the regional and statewide scale. So we're very fortunate to have Erika leading this program, as she brings excellent experience working for several local, regional, and state government and regulatory agencies in California, including the State Water Resources Control Board, Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board, and the California Coastal Commission. And Erika is an avid mountain biker and stand-up paddler. So our plan for today is for the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to ask the panelists a series of questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. So please feel free at any time to put your questions in the Q&A box. And once I get through the prepared questions, I'll go to those questions and ask as many of them of our panelists as I can in the remaining time. But before we start, we always like to get a sense of who's in the audience. So we're going to do a few quick poll questions to learn more about who's joining us today. So we're going to put those up on the screen. And if you could take just a few seconds to fill those out, we'll see who we've got with us. Give it a few more seconds before we. Let's see, I think that's pretty good. Hannah, why don't we close the poll So let's see, we've got about 43% of you are actual restoration project implementers, about 12% are funders, 10% from the regulatory community, and then another 35% other, unclassified. And then in terms of what type of organization you're associated with, it looks like we've got about 37% from NGOs, 15% from regulatory agencies, another 17% from private companies, and 18% individuals or foundation supporters. So we've got a great diversity of folks on today. And then lastly, to find out where you're joining us from, 27% of you are from the North Coast, 19% from the Central Coast, 27% from the Delta Central Valley area, and then a smattering from the Sierras, South Coast, Inland Empire, and then about 18% in the other category. So, it stopped sharing results. There we go. So anyway, that's great, a great diversity of folks, and we're really looking forward to the conversation today. So let's get started. Jennifer, we're going to start with you. And before we get into cutting the green tape, the initiative itself, can you share with us the resources agency's view about the current state of our natural resources in California, and particularly habitat and the incredible array of species unique and special to California, and then why the Secretary felt a need to launch this initiative?
Sure, and thanks, Ashley, for inviting me. It's nice to be on this panel with my friends, Erika and Kellyx. We've worked together a lot over the last 6 months. Yeah, so if any of you have heard Secretary Crowfoot speak, you know he's incredibly passionate about biodiversity and conservation and about getting things done. And so I think cutting the green tape sort of is the sweet spot for all of those things. Stepping back big picture, hopefully most of our audience is aware of the executive order that Governor Newsom signed in, was it November? All these months are running together. Elevating biodiversity as a statewide priority, really recognizing that we have unique biodiversity in California and that we need to do more to protect it. And setting an ambitious goal of conserving 30% of California by 2030, which is really exciting. It's a big visionary goal that is going to take a lot of people working together across all sectors to make it happen. But a piece of that is the recognition that to protect biodiversity, it's not enough just to protect places that are pristine and untouched. We have a lot of work to do to restore damaged systems that have seen our hands in the past. And that's where cutting the green tape comes in. And I really give credit to Kellyx. Guess they had a meeting with Secretary Crowfoot about a year ago, and they said, you know, we want to do more restoration in the state, but it's really kind of a pain. And he said, well, let's fix that. And so they launched these roundtable conversations. But at the same time, he started really thinking about how can I get someone to help me with this more full time? And that led to my position and me coming on in June. So cutting the green tape is a big part of my portfolio. Also implementing the 30 by 30 strategy. So it all fits together, which is really nice. So, you know, big picture, we really recognize that, you know, restoration has to happen faster. We need it to happen at a larger scale and in a more integrated way that has better monitoring long-term and just better coordination across the landscape. And so my responsibility is to run point on that. Obviously, I'm just one person. The government is a big bureaucracy, but there are a lot of people working across resources agency and other places that are interested in this issue. And I'm sort of pulling together those best practices, being a point person for conversation, giving people sort of license to take chances, trying to find resources for people to, you know, actually do some creative work around restoration permitting, and hopefully, you know, keep this ball rolling as we move along. I know we'll talk more about the actual report that came out after these guys speak, but that's sort of where we stand. We recognize it's a really big priority and it's something that we're investing a lot in.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Kellyx, I think it'd be great if you could let the audience know about who the California Landscape Stewardship Network is, and maybe just share with us your early conversations with Secretary Crowfoot that led him to launch the Cutting the Green Tape initiative.
Sure. First, I should say the executive order was signed on October 7th. It was my birthday, and I was pretty certain it was a gift for me.
That's right. I did do that on purpose. I forgot. Thanks.
The California Landscape Stewardship Network is a diverse range of partnerships from across the state that started coming together in 2016 to overcome some of the barriers that we face to cross-boundary landscape scale stewardship. Included groups from the Southern Sierras, the Orange County coast, the Santa Cruz Mountains, Tahoe, North Coast, Bay Area. And we formed to address some of the large pressing challenges that require that we work together in new ways across boundaries and at appropriate scale and pace. So for example, we've been working on systems change on cross-boundary or cross-agency data sharing to increase efficiencies with regional planning and restoration, et cetera. And one of the priorities was looking at regulatory barriers to restoration. So Secretary Crowfoot heard about this coalition of the willing, as he called us, and was realized that we were really representing stewardship of about 40% of the geography of California, and invited us to meet with him, at which point, as Jen mentioned, we brought up this concern. And we talked with him about a lot of things that we were doing, but he really connected with this immediate need for regulatory efficiencies. The idea that we could improve regulations, processes, and policies so that environmental stewardship could occur more quickly, more simply, more cost effectively. So then he created this forum, which came to be known as Cutting Green Tape, and we helped facilitate that forum.
Great. So turning to you, Erika, we know that sustainable conservation has recognized this problem of regulatory review and permitting being a barrier to restoration for a couple of decades. Can you briefly tell us what's been put in place over the past 20 years to facilitate more restoration and lay the groundwork for cutting the green tape?
Yeah, sure. I'll be as brief as I can, because we've been engaged in this space for a really long time for removing barriers to restoration, and at many levels, including working on policy and funding mechanisms to incentivize restoration. But really our most public-facing work has been around the development of efficient permitting mechanisms, including programmatic permits. And I know that many of you out there are quite familiar with these programmatic permits, but just to make sure we're all working from the same definition, these are permits that are written in advance to cover the most commonly done project types, where all of the rules and essential conditions to protect the environment are all written up front. And so these permits can really save a lot of time and resources for project proponents and agencies. They create more regulatory certainty, and then they allow agency staff more time to partner with project proponents and provide technical assistance. And as Ashley mentioned, we started developing these programmatic permits as part of coordinated permitting programs with the resource conservation districts on a county by county level. And those programs were definitely successful. The average number of projects increased about 5-fold per area, but the problem is that they were very expensive at about $300,000 to $500,000 each, and then took about 3 to 5 years for each program. And in the end, the conditions in each of the permits ended up looking very, very similar. So recognizing that inefficiency, we switched to developing statewide programmatic permits in coordination with all the state and federal agencies, rather than piecemealing the job and potentially taking decades to get the work done. And a lot has happened since then. So in summary, we've helped NOAA Restoration Center develop what they call biological opinions to cover projects in anadromous fish habitat along the California coast and in the Central Valley. We helped NOAA to acquire consistency determinations from the California Coastal Commission, which have been a major time and money saver. And then NOAA has continued to do an excellent job expanding the scope of their BOs, and they've covered more than 150 projects using that program. With the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we sponsored the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act back in 2014, which is for small scale projects, and it works in coordination with the Water Board's small scale permit and is a very a highly expedited process for projects 5 acres or less. Right now, what we're working on is we're building off of those authorizations we did with NOAA and the Coastal Commission, and working on 2 more statewide authorizations. So first, we're helping the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service develop a statewide Federal Endangered Species Act authorization. We're developing a biological assessment, which helps them to work on biological opinions. And this would cover permitting for species that are commonly encountered with habitat restoration projects. The NOAA Restoration Center and Army Corps are also leads on that effort. At the same time, we're working with the State Water Resources Control Board to develop a statewide general permit, as well as a programmatic environmental impact report. And they are coordinated with all the conditions and cover the same project types as the NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service BOs that I just mentioned. The Army Corps of Engineers is also part of the process, because they benefit from more efficient permitting with these other agencies, because their processes are legally linked. And once all these permits are in place, we're going to continue with our technical assistance to all the agencies and project proponents, as well as create a dedicated website to help folks take advantage of these permits.
Great. Thanks, Erika. So let's get into the Cutting the Green Tape initiative and the report. Kellyx, maybe describe the process that you and the Stewardship Network led to produce the recommendations, and then give us a brief overview of them.
Okay, sure. So just to be clear, this effort absolutely stands on the shoulders of giants, and particularly the work of Sustainable Conservation, who's been a leader in this space, and other essential partners. And as a practitioner, I regularly use a number of the efficiencies that Sustainable Conservation created. And this also builds on the 2002 Secretary Nichols task force on removing barriers to restoration that resulted in a number of efficiencies. So many of the recommendations in this report directly support or build on these other efforts. It's not a standalone separate effort. So over the past year, we held a series of roundtables and dozens of phone calls engaging over 150 people from environmental nonprofits, restoration practitioners, advocacy groups, large landowner groups, public and private land managers, local, state, and federal government agencies, tribes, water utilities, working lands, businesses, the whole gamut that touches on this topic. And all of these stakeholders identified 45 potential actions that form the basis of the 14 recommendations in our report. Our recommendations, I should note, where the opportunity was the invitation that came from Secretary Crowfoot, and then the partnership that he brought in with the head of the State Water Board and the head of Cal EPA and the head of California Department of Food and Ag. So we really focused on where there are opportunities at the state level, not on any of the federal permitting or regulatory barriers there may be to restoration. And the recommendations in this report are at really intentionally different scales. Some are calling for incremental improvements, others for broader systems changes, some that can be implemented right away, others that require additional groundwork. Some call for a clarification of things that exist or interpretation, some for programmatic solutions, some for legislative solutions, and some really simply for how we work together better, with a wide range of potential implementing entities. And when of those 45 recommendations, when often they had a fair bit of overlap or similarities, and the difference was really about what approach to take to the same problem, and where multiple approaches were recommended for the same end goal, we chose to advance recommendations that were rooted in empowering agency staff to own the solution. So we typically recommended legislative approaches when that was the only pathway. And they focus on, there's a set of recommendations focused on small scale habitat restoration, a set of recommendations for larger. We looked at work in the coastal zone, work specific to that would involve changing water rights, some that were about sort of administrative ways that you apply for and track permitting, those types of things, but all comes down to 14 recommendations in the report.
Great. And folks should have gotten a link to the report in the invitation to the webinar or the reminder to the webinar, so you can go and look at those directly. So Jennifer, now that the recommendations are out and have been released, can you just speak a little bit to how you and the resources agencies see them being implemented?
Yeah, so it's interesting, Kellyx is right. Like the secretary really gave the emphasis around convening this group, but there were no boundaries on it. And so it ended up that we got a suite of recommendations delivered to Secretary Crowfoot, but they have a wide range of sort of audiences in a way. So a piece of those are within the resources agency's sort of purview. And we're taking a look at those now that we've received them and trying to figure out how we can implement those moving forward. So we're currently reviewing those. But there's a larger array that really are, they're the Water Board or the Coastal Commission, where we're going to reach out and try to partner with them and start those conversations, for example. And then there's a whole separate suite of things that are really not ours, like sort of legislative changes that are recommended or regulatory reforms for certain things. So in those contexts, I think we would be focused on being, technical assistance. That's not something that we would take the lead on. So we're still sorting through which of the things we're going to champion in the coming year. And hopefully very soon we'll have sort of an action plan for how to implement. But I just want to point out, sort of back to what I said at the beginning, like this series of roundtables was a real catalyst for a broader conversation about cutting green tape, which I'm now owning as my initiative beyond the roundtable conversation, as something that we're really trying to do across multiple different entities. And so that's going to continue to move forward as well. CDFW has some initiatives. They got some one-time funding through the legislature last year. They're trying to do some pilot work on programmatic permitting and more integrated funding and permitting that works together. We've got, obviously we're going to continue to support the 401 programmatic that Erika referenced. The Coastal Commission has some ideas about programmatic work that they're having conversations on. I'm also supporting or trying to be helpful in the context of the Central Valley. There's a lot of large scale restoration projects that are underway. So just improving our communication and our conversation. So all of that is ongoing. And I guess I would just say to the audience, like I'm here as sort of ombudswoman on cutting green tape and here to try to solve problems and see if we can't get restoration done. So.
That's great. And I have to say, we're really glad that Secretary Crowfoot created this position because you have a lot on your plate to do. So thank you.
Something I believe in. So if anybody's worked with me in the past, they know I like government to sort of work efficiently. So it's something that I'm dedicated to trying to be as helpful as I can. So thanks.
Kellyx, do you want to add your thoughts, now that we're at the implementation phase?
Sure. Echoing a fair bit of what Jen said, the recommendations call for actions by state agencies, practitioners, and advocates alike who are committed to environmental stewardship. And that's just the report. This idea of cutting green tape is also being worked on by a number of different entities, around the state. And the report reflects this moment in time that we hope will catalyze broader participation and support for these recommendations and beyond. And as Jen said, the Resources Agency will continue to advance cutting green tape efforts through implementation of relevant recommendations from the report that are under their purview. And then there are other partners like Sustainable Conservation and many super knowledgeable folks who are on this webinar in this event. The California Landscape Stewardship Network, one of the things that we're doing is tracking where there may be some intersectional opportunities where there are other efforts moving forward that really speak to cutting green tape and where we might all be, rowing in the same direction. And similarly, we're aware that there are a number of folks who are thinking about sponsoring legislation or what have you. And we've been talking about our capacity to maybe convene a conversation around that to make sure, again, that we're rowing in the same direction and that no one who wants to support this is unintentionally, diminishing another effort or working at, cross purposes. So that's something that we would be willing to do if folks who are thinking about advancing legislation are interested in, being in the virtual room together, they can contact me and I'd be happy to help do that. And then other than that, implementation, right now, this report is focused on regulatory efficiencies. The California Landscape Stewardship Network is also, when we talk about cutting green tape, and also earlier conversations that we had with Secretary Crowfoot, we're also thinking about funding and data sharing and other aspects of where we could be more efficient. So this is a particular point with really, I think, important and powerful recommendations. But the movement really is broader than that.
Great. And this is my first chance to plug a survey that we're going to send out after this. And one of the questions will be, how would you like to be involved in cutting the green tape going forward? So I encourage everybody to fill that out. I think it'll help us coordinate efforts. So thank you for that, Kellyx. So before we open it up to questions, let's just dive in a little bit to some of the specific recommendations. And Erika, maybe you could pick up on where you left off on the State Water Board effort, which is included in recommendation 6, which I think says develop the 401 general order and waste discharge requirement for aquatic restoration projects and certify the associated programmatic environmental impact report. So can you just briefly talk about what's currently in progress and where folks on this webinar can play a role in helping get it implemented?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the big news that we want everybody to know is that the State Water Board draft general order, the permit, and their draft programmatic environmental impact report, we expect those to be out for public review around the end of February. And so we really hope that you all take the opportunity to show your support for this effort during the public comment period, and then let the board know how important these efficient permitting mechanisms are to help you get your projects done and make the most of your funding. And I also want to just put in a plug as well that once these authorizations are in place, please do take advantage of them. You know, it's a new process. Sometimes it takes folks a little time to adapt, but if your projects qualify for these general permits, it'll be way more efficient than trying to get an individual permit. And then you could also really take advantage of all of the information that's in the CEQA document to help cover your individual projects. So keep an eye out for that public notice and chime in.
And now, Erika, what other recommendations do you see sustainable conservation playing an active role on, just so our audience knows?
Sure. So we are certainly going to be supportive of all of them and provide, any collaborations and assistance we can to Jennifer and all the folks at the Landscape Stewardship Network. But we're going to be especially active in those recommendations that revolve around the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act, the State Water Board efforts, and also California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So first, there were a number of mentions of the HRE Act, and that act sunsets at the end of next year. And so one of our first priorities is going to be working on reauthorization of the act. And we think that's something that can be done relatively easily, hopefully through an omnibus bill, and then we'll be talking to DFW about that. There were a number of other amendments also proposed to the HRE Act in the Cutting the Green Tape recommendations. And if there were any changes to be made, we would want to pursue that in a separate bill so we don't take any risks with the act. We sent out a survey to project proponents who have utilized the act, and they made it loud and clear that this is a really helpful process to them, and we don't want to do anything to jeopardize the act. So we plan to talk with DFW, share some of the results of the survey, and discuss any potential amendments with them after the act is reauthorized. There's also recommendation number 7, which talks about the Department of Fish and Wildlife building off of the work, our work with the State Water Resources Control Board to develop a complementary permitting mechanism for large scale projects outside of the scope of the HRE. And we've been talking to them about this idea for a while now, and we're going to continue to offer them assistance as they make decisions on what they want to do next and what's going to work for them. But in the meantime, I will say that they have been taking a very active role in providing feedback on the protection measures in the State Water Board's CEQA document and also in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service authorization, and that input has been very helpful. So once we're done with these permitting efforts, there's definitely going to be a lot of material for the department to draw upon if they choose to do something programmatic. And then the cutting the green tape recommendations did mention the possibility of something legislative. So certainly if they chose to go that direction, we would try and take a lead role because of our involvement in HRE and these other permits. One last thing regarding the numerous CEQA recommendations that were in the cutting the green tape. We hope, and I'm sure others hope who are experts on CEQA and who have been involved in this, we were involved in helping to facilitate and participate on the Mary Nichols committee that helped come up with the 15333 exemption. And we've been working on potential language changes for a number of years now, discussing with agencies and legislative staff. And ultimately, we hope that a group of experts can come together and really come up with a coordinated and strategic approach on potential changes so they have a higher likelihood of success. And so we can also avoid any potential unintended outcomes anytime you consider a CEQA reopener.
Great. Thank you, Erika. So let's open it up for questions. I see we've got a few already in the Q&A. I want to encourage anybody who has a question to please add them. I'm going to start out. First one was please indicate how to access the new regs. And I just want to say there aren't new regulations yet. This was a report with recommendations, and you should have a link to that report in the notice you got about the webinar. So Erika, the first question is for you. Who is the lead federal agency for the programmatic consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
So there's actually three. There's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service themselves, because they have funding programs and they initiate a lot of projects. There's also the NOAA Restoration Center and the Army Corps of Engineers. So we have three.
Okay.
So there's a lot of ways to access. There will be a lot of ways to access those via the BO when it's done.
Okay. Let's see. Next question. Related to the functionally equivalent alternative regulatory approaches, that was in quotes, described in recommendation 10, do any of the panelists have any clarity who will develop those approaches? So for example, the state board versus the regional board. And Kellyx, maybe you'll start that one.
Yeah. So when we said that the recommendations were at really different scales and some would require additional groundwork, this was one of the main ones. So that was one that was, more aspirational, I think, in terms of having a really different vision for how landscape scale work could be done. And there were a number of different types of entities that were floated about, but it depended on what the goal was of the particular program. And so the process that's happened to date didn't flesh that out entirely. That is one that would take some work moving forward. It might not be only one, it could be several.
Okay. Let's see, this goes back to the question, Erika, you were answering, I think, with the Natural Resource Conservation Service being such a large funder of voluntary restoration projects in the state. Are they involved in this, and why aren't they a lead agency as well?
So it's my understanding that they have developed their own separate programmatic biological opinion. And I would go as far to say that Jennifer may know about this from her former role at the Fish and Wildlife Service. So I think that they will already have the coverage. There's also a potential at some point, there is this potential for late arriving action agencies, which is a separate process and maybe a little wonky to get into here, but I think they already have some coverage.
Okay. Great. Next question. Beyond the programmatic permits, what plans does the Natural Resources Agency have for improving the process? For example, communications, coordination, clarifying requirements and policies, mitigation requirements. So I think that one's for you, Jennifer.
Well, that's an easy question. I mean, it goes along the lines of what I've said earlier. This is now a priority for the secretary. I think the entities within the California Resources Agency are all really, and I've been pretty impressed with this, that we've had some conversations with the chief deputies for all the different conservancies and departments, and there is a strong commitment toward this larger effort, and so I would say that it's ongoing. It's an ongoing dialogue that we're having, and people are making efforts to see if there are ways they can be more efficient. But a lot of what we're trying to do too is work across agencies, work more with the water board, be more proactive, think ahead of time as projects are coming online, especially these ones that are big, large landscape scale, multi-agency projects, really trying to think in advance about what some of the roadblocks might be and see if there are ways we can build teams that can work together across landscapes, across multiple projects, and sort of address some of these larger problems together. That's something that I'm really invested in. You know, I've peeked into the BRIT model that's being used in around the Bay. I really think that's something that, in my experience, I mean, programmatic permits are one of my favorites, but also these multi-agency teams where you really get people, if there's going to be recurring gnarly problems that you got to deal with, getting those teams together and have them be sort of cooperating on a longer term basis can really lead, there's more work up front, but it can lead to some real efficiencies down the line. So that's one of the things that I'm looking in to see if we could get funding or other resources to stand up for places that are expecting a lot of restoration.
That'd be great. I think that would be really, really helpful. Erika, did you want to add to that?
I just wanted to add regarding the BRIT and that format of having all the agencies work together. Absolutely great. We fully support that. I would like to just add that the programmatic permits are something those folks can use as a tool for those projects that fit in the scope of the programmatic permits. And then they have more time to really work on those more complex projects and help come to agreement on those.
I agree 100%. I mean, programmatic permits, one of the best things about them is you get these sort of things you do over and over again out of your hair, right? So you can deal with the things that are really harder and unique. So there is a lot of benefit to that. Somebody's asking, what does BRIT stand for? Kellyx, you know what it stands for? It's
restoration. San Francisco Bay. It's the San Francisco Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team.
Thank you.
It's staff from I think 6 state and federal regulatory agencies that have jurisdiction over habitat restoration projects in San Francisco Bay. I wanted to note that that I think that the devil is partly in the details and also partly in the intent and purpose. Or it's still, you know, it's still the individuals and the spirit and intent they bring to these processes, because you can have interagency collaborations that have funding and participation and MOUs and lots of documents, but not streamlined restoration. You know, it can be an extensive pre-application process that is similar to other pre-application processes. So I think that cutting green tape is as much a culture as it is a program or a process. And so it's going to be interesting. We're definitely paying attention. There's the Integrated Watershed Restoration Program of the Central Coast, 3 counties of the Central Coast. That is a more informal process that was built, that was based on relationships really as much as anything else. There's BRIT, there's some other things that have happened around the state. I'm really interested in some of the case studies that I think are going to be coming up, evaluating these, and what are the lessons learned and what are the sort of irreducible elements of integration. We talk about these integration efforts under a big umbrella because we know we want coordination, but what are the elements that actually make that coordination facilitate getting projects done more efficiently and effectively is, I think, a piece that we as a community still need to learn so that we can advance.
And that makes me want to give a shout out to PPIC that has is investing some time and energy in that very question this year with some research. So Letitia
And for those who don't know that acronym, that's Public Policy Institute of California, and specifically the Water Policy Center. Yeah. Yep. Okay, I'm going to go back to some questions. Which species are covered by the new programmatic efforts? The Prop 1 draft PSN notes CGT. Oh, notes, I guess that must be cutting green tape and priorities led through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's North Coast Salmon Project. Interested to hear how this will work. Maybe species covered by programmatic efforts. You want to take that piece of it, Erika?
Yeah, sure. let me see the species. So I see Casey's question, but
This question, just so you know, is from the chat box, not in the Q.
oh, okay,
Let everyone
great.
put their
This-
questions in the
so
Q&A.
species that would be covered would be those that are commonly encountered with restoration projects. And so it won't be everything under the sun. The Fish and Wildlife Service will make that final determination. But right now we have quite a few species and that are being considered by them. And we came up with that list of species by doing a survey of restoration project proponents throughout the state, as well as all of the project types. So that's how we came up with those, the list of species, as well as talking with agency staff around the state on kind of what types of critters they encounter with projects.
Great. Okay, another question. Does this also accommodate a traditional peer programmatic environmental impact report approach with added regulatory flexibility and innovation contained therein? Or does it just embrace functional equivalent CEQA documents? If the former, how would that intersect with other CEQA programmatic docs? So for instance, FRGP, which is the Fisheries Restoration Grant Program, or the State Water Board's 401 General Order. And this is referring to recommendation 10.
So I'll take a stab at this. So I was eyeing that, Darren, when you posted that in the chat box. I think this is also similar to one of the other questions that came up in the Q&A thing about whether there's another, whether there's going to be another forum. There was another question that came up about whether there's going to be additional web calls about the recommendations and other efforts. I think that maybe we should consider having a down in the weeds geeking out forum on some of the stuff, because you know, as we worked really hard to get these recommendations out, and now we're spending time thinking about what implementation is going to look like. And I think that part of implementation of these recommendations will necessarily involve bringing in experts and practitioners who really know this stuff to do a deeper dive on some of the specifics about what it would or wouldn't include. And there's no hidden agenda, no information that isn't in the report about the recommendations, including the list of all of the potential actions. So basically at this point, if you've read that report, you know what we know. And so if there's something that's not in that report, it means it's something that really wasn't developed yet. And that's for all of us on this call and beyond in this community to work on together.
Great, thanks, Kellyx. Let's see, here's a question about, is invasive species removal, parentheses, weeds, covered in the broad interpretation of restoration activities?
Yes.
Okay, well, that was a good short one.
The recommendations in the report, certainly it's for habitat restoration and other environmentally beneficial projects. I want to be clear that our intent when writing up these recommendations was not even to limit it to ecological restoration. It's for environmentally beneficial practices. There might be, you know, carbon sequestration in healthy soils, that there might be, you know, water quality improvements, et cetera. There's other things that are environmentally beneficial, not just ecological restoration. And habitat restoration is not limited even to, there's an anonymous attendee also asks about whether cutting green tape can be applied to beyond riparian habitat. And the recommendations in the report, and certainly the work that Sustainable Conservation has done, is not limited to riparian habitat in any way.
Yeah, so just so folks know that question, it was, can this type of coordinated response to green tape be applied to other critical restoration needs, such as prescribed burning? We need to look at whole watershed needs, not just riparian habitat. So does anyone want to add to Kellyx's?
Actually, I want to add to Kellyx's.
Okay, go ahead.
One other thing to that, which is that the way that we bookended where we would focus on developing these recommendations is there may be a lot of things that have to do with stewardship of lands that would benefit from regulatory efficiencies. And they may have a number of benefits. We specifically focused on projects that have environmental benefits, making sure that environmental regulations are right fitting. So making sure that environmental regulations don't slow down environmental benefit essentially was where we were focused. And so where controlled burns have environmental benefits, it seems like there's a lot of places where they might fit into the recommendations that were made. There might be other things that people want to do for landscape scale stewardship having to do with minimizing risk of wildfire, for example. That wasn't a focus of this particular effort, but if there are projects that have multi-benefits, there may be projects that really are restoration projects that have other benefits as well. But I think if the recommendations, you know, if you look at them on face, they're about environmental improvements, and if a project fits into those statutes or those programs, the recommendations that we made in this report don't change that.
Jennifer, do you want to, or Erica, do you want to add? Jennifer,
I just wanted to add that, you know, specific to forest, you know, forest fire issues, controlled burns, etc. Jessica Morse, who is the Deputy Secretary for all things forests and forest fire, she's been working really hard on similar types of programmatic permitting to facilitate restoration in the forests. And so if folks want more information about that, I can connect them to her. But that's a whole separate program that really isn't embedded in this conversation, that is really specific to addressing catastrophic fire risk. So,
forest health. Next question. Is there still an effort underway to look at increasing the 500-foot limit on the 401 small habitat restoration order? Even with the new order coming online, that seems like it could be quite valuable for permitting smaller projects. Who wants to take that? Erica?
I can take a stab at that. I will say that this is something that we've also been talking to the state water board about for quite some time. And I know that they had been working on some materials a while ago. It is one of the recommendations to expand that authorization. And so we certainly will offer our assistance and what we've learned from restoration project proponents about expansion and of the general order for small scale permits. I think it'll be a very important move and complementary move to the large scale permit.
And it is one of the recommendations in the report, and it had a great deal of support across a number of, you know, there wasn't a lot of concern expressed about that initially.
Yeah, and I think folks have really found that 500 linear feet limit quite constraining. So that would be a good change.
I would just quickly add for folks that I think that's really something that's important to communicate to the state water board. Any changes or that you think would be beneficial for that small scale permit to help you get your projects done.
So next question. This is really great news about the recommendations, exclamation point. How do you promote trust and confidence between regulators and permittees so that these recommendations can be efficiently implemented? Many times regulators want to pile on more requirements due to a lack of trust. It's a good question. Who wants to take the first stab at that?
All yours, Jen.
I mean, to me, this is the crux of everything we do in every context, everywhere, right? When you have relationships, when you understand what people are trying to get done, you don't hide your agenda, you treat people with respect, you work in good faith, things get done. And I think it's true. I mean, I was a regulator for a long time, and people would come in and just a priori assume that I was out to get them. And I wasn't. I was just trying to do my job, you know? And so I think there's a lot of room across the board. I would not pick any actor as particularly more difficult or less. Everybody has a responsibility in these systems to try to show up and do their best work in good faith. And, you know, and when you don't find good faith, you know, try to get help, you know, reach out to someone else and say, I'm not getting there. But I think we should approach each other sort of with the base assumption that everybody cares about the environment and we're all here to do good work. And that will go a long way towards starting to build that trust, which I think happens one relationship at a time. It's not easy.
Great. Well said. Let me see. I think there was another question on here.
You know, just to expand on what Jennifer was saying, I think, as you know, being a former regulatory person, I think, you know, working with the laws that and the system and the processes that the agencies have. I mean, you know, they don't really set up, the Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act doesn't really have a lot of tools for regulatory agency folks to restore and recover the environment. We know it's all these projects are regulated under the same set of rules. And so we're kind of really of the philosophy that by putting restoration on a separate permitting track with separate tools, whether it's the HRE Act, whether it's programmatic permits, and then having the funding, the technical assistance, all the regulatory tools and kind of in one house, just like the FRGP program or NOAA Restoration Center in their program, it really helps the agency staff to prioritize those projects and work in partnership with project proponents. And we think that's gonna, you know, having more of those tools is going to help build relationships, make it an easier process for everyone.
I would just add, though, that everybody who's a regulator would like to get to work on a restoration project, not just a giant freeway. And so I'm resistant to this idea that we should put, you know, the people who do the fun stuff into one box and the people who have to do all the stuff that's kind of heartbreaking in another. So just giving a shout out to all my friends in the conservation community. Huh?
Maybe they're rotating assignments.
Something, because it's fun. It's fun when you get to do restoration projects. It really is.
Yeah, I've been there. I've been in that battle as an agency employee.
I think we have time for a couple more. Will the new order, the large scale permit, be expanded to include in-channel work and projects requiring dewatering?
Yes. Yes, it will. There are conditions that will be laid out that, you know, we basically tried to pull together the agencies commonly issued conditions on, you know, dewatering and in-channel work, and there'll be a suite of those included, but absolutely, yes.
Okay. Next question. We anticipate the conversion of significant acreage of irrigated farmland due to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in the Central Valley. It is a tremendous opportunity for upland habitat restoration. This initiative seems like a great fit and suggests streamlining and a programmatic approach. Without going into a lot of detail, I'm on a team drafting the plan EAIS, not sure what that stands for proposed restoration on 20,000 acres called out in a groundwater sustainability plan. So not sure this was so much a question as a comment, but does anybody want to comment on upland habitat restoration?
Kellyx?
I'm not sure I understand what the question is. Yes.
Yes, support.
I vote yes.
Okay, it may have been more of a comment, and I think generally what I think Kellyx you're saying is that the cutting the green tape recommendations are supportive of making that easier, as you know, not just aquatic habitat restoration easier,
Yes, absolutely,
restoration as well.
That's right. The recommendations in the report by no means are limited to aquatic habitat.
Yeah. Okay. How do you envision empowering regional regulatory agency staff to embrace change in permitting standards and approaches?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, so I think I think what you're asking is, you know, if these are coming at the state level or coming down from the State Water Board or from the Resources Agency, how do you ensure that they're you know, adopted as intended from, you know, local and regional staff who are the boots on the ground getting these permits done? I assume that that's what you mean. And it was definitely a big focus of the conversation throughout. You know, when the California Landscape Stewardship Network started working on this, topic before we had the opportunity that came about with Secretary Crowfoot. We were thinking about this more in terms of like social change and culture change. How does that happen? We hired a consultant to help us think that through. That's when we started doing dozens of phone calls and talking with folks like Sustainable Conservation and others who've been in this space. And talked a lot with agency staff who are, you know, who hold the line, you know, and see, you know, what we heard from a number of local and regional agency staff is your restoration is voluntary. You can choose whether or not to do it. But I've spent the last 20 plus years trying to make sure, you know, hold the line, make sure this one critter doesn't go extinct in this area. And the buck stops with me. And so, you know, how to make sure that that folks are supported in making decisions that advance projects, how to make sure that they're informed about what this is, how to make sure that agency staff is resourced to be able to do these things. I think some of that comes back to us and the practitioner community to support making sure the agency staff are adequately funded. And then also, you know, I think that we have requests of the heads of agencies and departments that went to push this down through the agencies. And I remember one of my first conversations with Jen, she talked about unleashing the creativity and passion of agency staff so that they can work on the things that they want to work on and help get them through. And so these aspects of trust and culture change were baked into the development of these recommendations. It was a very meaty part of the conversation, and there wasn't a silver bullet for that. But I think that it means that a set of recommendations isn't enough, right? This comes back to all of us to make sure that we're advancing these solutions collectively. I'm sorry if that's not a clear or simple answer, but it's just not a clear or simple issue.
Yeah. Well, oh, Erika, you want to add to that, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay, I can just briefly reflect on that from the work that we're doing. Is we recognize how important the regional agency office roles are, and they're, you know, putting their blood, sweat, and tears into all this work and trying to protect the resources. At the same time, of course, you know, the restoration project proponents are trying to get it done, but we have included mechanisms in the permits we're developing. It's not like all the decisions are going to be made in Sacramento. There's a mechanism for the field offices to engage and make the decisions, provide the technical assistance directly to project proponents, and to help work with them to qualify for these programmatic authorizations if they see that they fit, you know, if they have the opportunity to fit. So they'll be engaged directly.
Great. So with that, I just want to thank all of you, all three of you, very much for joining us and being our expert panelists today. And I want to thank everyone that's joined us for all the work everyone has been doing and will be doing to accelerate badly needed restoration in California. We look forward to working together with you all on implementing the Cutting the Green Tape recommendations and other efforts. You're going to receive a survey, which we appreciate you filling out. I think we're going to put it in the chat box, but we'll also send it to you via email. And we'd love to get your feedback on this webinar. We'd love your suggestions for future topics. And also, really importantly, to learn more about your interest in the next steps for cutting the green tape. So please do take a few minutes to fill the survey out. This is the last of Sustainable's Check-in and Connect series for 2020, but we will be continuing this into 2021. So please check back with our website about webinars and panel discussions in January. We're planning a series of conversations for the first half of next year about food and the environment. And until then, I'm wishing everyone a happy and COVID-free holidays. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.